I'm Mikasa Harper, and let me tell you a story. My story. One that no one believed until it was almost too late. On the surface, I had it all. A respected title at Whitman Co., a husband who smiled for holiday photos, and a place at the table in one of Nashville's most prestigious families. But underneath the manicured brunches and curated Christmas cards, there was rot. The kind that doesn't strike fast like lightning, but poisons slowly, drop by drop, hidden in sweet coffee and polite laughter. For months, I doubted myself. Every hospital visit, every unexplained illness, every maybe it's stress diagnosis made me question my sanity more than my safety. But suspicion is a quiet voice at first, easy to ignore, easier to dismiss, until it starts screaming in your ears. It wasn't a dramatic betrayal, not at first. It was subtler. Missed meetings, slurred speech, a tremor in my hands that I couldn't explain. And then came the glances between Ethan and Vanessa. Too fast and too practiced. The coffee they insisted I drink. The brunch I'll never forget. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's a story about survival. About how I turned the table, literally, and made them drink the life they thought they could steal from me. If you're going to betray someone, you'd better make sure they're not smarter, quieter, and far more patient than you think. Because I was watching, and I never forgot a single detail. Don't you want to try the coffee I made especially for you, honey? Ethan's voice carried the kind of warmth you'd expect from a devoted husband, if you weren't listening too closely. But I had learned to listen. To everything. The way his hand lingered just a second too long on the mug. The overly rehearsed smile, the faint tension in Vanessa's jaw as she sat across the dining table, stirring her untouched cup in slow, precise circles. We were at Vanessa's estate on Maple Grove Drive, an elegant Georgian-style house in the wealthier folds of Nashville. Sunday brunches at the Whitman household had become a tradition I never asked for but couldn't refuse, at least not without raising questions, and questions I'd learned were dangerous, especially when you already knew the answers but didn't have the evidence. Yet. The coffee cup in front of me steamed gently, its aroma strange, not burnt or bitter, but off, almost metallic with a trace of sweetness that didn't belong. My stomach turned. I smiled anyway. "That's thoughtful of you," I said, reaching for my phone with deliberate casualness. "Let me just check one thing for work before I take a sip." Vanessa tilted her head slightly, watching me like a hawk watches a mouse pretending to be asleep. She wore a muted silk blouse and her usual forced serenity, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. "Ethan's been practicing all week," she said with a grin that didn't touch her eyes. "Pour-overs, cold brew, AeroPress. He's becoming quite the barista. Just for you. Just for me." I forced a light laugh and nodded, my fingers tightening under the table. There it was again, the way she emphasized those words. It always came back to performance, to keeping up appearances. Vanessa was a master of that, and Ethan had learned quickly. For the last 6 months, I'd been collecting symptoms like loose threads, tugging at them quietly while everyone else went about their perfect lives. The fatigue, the dizziness, the slurred speech, the 3 emergency room visits. Doctors couldn't explain it, but my gut had. Long before I found the vial in Ethan's drawer, or the messages he forgot to delete from his phone. This morning was never just brunch. It was a test, a line in the sand. And I had come prepared. "Oh, would you mind if I used your study, Vanessa?" I said, rising with practiced grace. "Just need to make a quick call." Vanessa's lips tightened for the briefest moment before she gestured toward the hallway. "Of course," she replied, her tone silky. "Just don't break anything." "Wouldn't dream of it." As I passed behind her chair, I let my hip brush the table edge, just enough to jostle the silverware and cause a minor distraction. I fumbled, let out a soft, "Oh," steadied myself, switching our coffee cups in one fluid, trembling movement. Vanessa didn't notice, or maybe she did, but assumed I was clumsy as always. I walked briskly toward the study, heart pounding against my ribs. I didn't lock the door. I didn't need to. From the doorway, I had a perfect view of the dining room and, more importantly, of Vanessa. She sipped. Once, twice, then she paused. Her fingers twitched. She set the cup down carefully, like it had become suddenly foreign. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Her skin blanched. "Ethan?" she said, and I could hear the shakiness in her voice even from where I stood. "Something's wrong." Ethan looked up from his phone, confused at first, then horrified. That wasn't your cup." I hit record on my phone. Camera zoomed, capturing everything. Vanessa's trembling hands, Ethan's panic, the realization blooming in their faces like a stain too dark to wash out. They had failed the test. And now it was my turn. I watched from the doorway, my phone steady in hand, recording as the carefully manufactured image of my perfect family began to crack. Vanessa clutched the table with one hand, her other gripping her stomach as if trying to keep herself from unraveling. Her breathing grew shallow, her mouth opened again. But this time, only a dry gasp escaped. Ethan scrambled from his chair, nearly knocking it over in his rush to reach her. He dropped to his knees beside her, his voice a panicked whisper that still carried through the hushed dining room. "That wasn't supposed to be your cup." There it was, crystal clear, unmistakable. My heart should have been racing, but it wasn't. It was strangely steady. I stepped forward, slow and calm, like I was walking into a courtroom instead of back into the living room of my betrayers. "Vanessa," I said, my voice controlled. "Should I call an ambulance?" Her eyes shot toward me, wide with fear and something else. Realization. "You switched them," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You knew." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I dialed 911 with one hand, while my camera kept rolling in the other. "Yes, I need an ambulance at 1572 Maple Grove Drive. My sister-in-law appears to be having a severe reaction to something in her coffee. She's conscious, but her hands are trembling and her pulse seems unstable." Vanessa was now on the floor, propped against the leg of her chair. Her expensive blouse clung to her like wet silk, and her skin had turned an unnatural shade of pale. Ethan looked between me and her, eyes wild. "This wasn't the plan," he said under his breath. "It was just supposed to make her miss the presentation," I finished for him, arching an eyebrow. Vanessa tried to sit up, pain etched deep into her face. "You said it would just make her sick. You said it wouldn't be traceable." "You drugged me," I said quietly, "more than once, for months. And you kept going." The sound of sirens began to rise in the distance. Close now. Ethan stood, backing away slowly from the mess he'd made, his hands raised as if in surrender to no one. "I didn't want this," he said. "You have to believe me. I was just trying to help you take a break. You were overworking yourself." My mouth tightened. "So your solution was to poison me?" His silence was the answer I expected. The front door burst open as paramedics rushed in. I stepped aside, giving them space, then walked into the kitchen and sat at the breakfast bar, letting the phone finish its recording before sending the file directly to my encrypted folder. Then I forwarded it to Ryan Brooks, my lawyer, with a single message. "We begin now." I could hear Vanessa vomiting into a medical bag as one of the EMTs checked her vitals. The other started an IV line. Ethan hovered behind them, wringing his hands. "I'll ride with her," I said to the team. "I want to make sure my sister-in-law gets the treatment she needs." One of the paramedics nodded. "We've stabilized her for now. We'll be heading to Nashville General." I met Ethan's eyes as I followed the gurney out the door. "I'm sure the doctors will be very interested in knowing exactly what was in that coffee." The ER was colder than I remembered, brighter too, everything too white, too sterile. As I sat in the waiting area, the weight of the morning's events pressed hard on my chest, but not in fear, in certainty. I had proof now, no more theories, no more waiting to be believed. A nurse appeared at the double doors. "Family of Vanessa Whitman?" I stood. "I'm her sister-in-law." She gave me a professional smile, but her tone was urgent. "She's stable, but we found concerning levels of toxic compounds in her system. Dr. Phillips would like to speak with you." Dr. Evelyn Phillips was a woman of few words and fewer expressions. She stood outside the exam room, a tablet in hand and a furrow between her brows. "Miss Harper," she began, "can you tell me what happened today before your sister-in-law became ill?" I pulled out my phone. "Actually, I think you should hear this." I played the recording. The doctor listened in silence, her expression shifting from clinical concern to alarm. "This is serious," she said finally. "The compound in her blood, this wasn't accidental contamination. Someone put it there deliberately." At that moment, Ethan appeared at the end of the hallway, his face pale, his tie askew. "Mikasa, please," he called out. "Let me explain." Dr. Phillips raised her hand. "Security to room 412. Two guards began walking toward him. "You don't understand," Ethan said. "Vanessa was confused. She didn't mean it like that." I opened my phone again, scrolling to the screenshots I'd taken weeks ago. The ones from his messages with Vanessa. "Then what did you mean by this?" I asked, holding the screen up. "Make sure she's out before Henderson. That was from your phone, Ethan." His face crumpled. Behind me, through the glass window of room 412, I saw Vanessa watching, still weak, still pale. But her eyes were sharp, and I knew she hadn't given up yet. Vanessa's eyes didn't show fear anymore. They showed calculation. She was already thinking of her next move. 3 ER visits, 3 different symptoms, one constant. I always walked away with fewer answers and more doubt. The first time, I thought it was food poisoning. The second, dehydration. By the third, I stopped believing in coincidences. It had started small, a mild headache after brunch, fatigue that clung to me for days like smoke on silk. But I chopped it up to work stress, skipped a few meetings, and told myself to sleep more. That's the thing about being poisoned slowly. Your body protests, but your mind rationalizes. You want to believe you're just tired or sensitive or pushing yourself too hard. You want to believe it's you because the alternative is too terrifying. I sat now in the corner of my temporary apartment in East Nashville, a modest second-story walk-up above a consignment bookstore, surrounded by papers. I wasn't sure I wanted to keep reading. The wall across from me had become a timeline. Months of hospital visits, symptoms, calendar events, annotated receipts, even screenshots of Ethan's text messages. Ryan had told me to trust my instincts, but instincts weren't admissible in court. I needed evidence. I reached for the red folder Dr. Evelyn Monroe had sent over that morning, her preliminary analysis of my last blood work, paired with Vanessa's toxicology results. My stomach nodded. Consistent trace levels of an unapproved neuroregulatory compound. Cumulative exposure suggests multiple doses over a minimum 12-week period. 12 weeks. I let the words echo. It meant they had started earlier than I thought, long before the Henderson pitch even hit our calendar. A chill rippled through me. This wasn't just about business. This was personal. I looked down at the handwritten notes in the margins. Evelyn had circled a possible link to an experimental compound flagged by the FDA 2 years ago, one associated with memory degradation and cognitive suppression. Something used in pharmaceutical trials to control emotional responses. I leaned back, stunned. I hadn't imagined the fog, the lost words during presentations, the sudden inability to concentrate in meetings where I used to thrive. It hadn't been anxiety. It had been intent. I picked up my phone and opened the secure chat app Ryan had installed for us. I sent him a photo of Evelyn's report with a single message. "Tell me we can use this. Three dots danced on the screen for a moment before his reply arrived. Absolutely, but we'll need more. You have access to Ethan's work laptop? I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I glanced across the room at the backpack I hadn't opened since moving out. Inside was a spare key, one Ethan didn't know I still had, to his office at Whitman & Co. I had stayed quiet long enough. Later that afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I brewed myself, using a brand I bought with cash from a gas station across town. Paranoia doesn't feel irrational when you have chemical proof in your blood. It feels like preparation. As I sipped, I replayed old voicemails Ethan had left during my hospital stays. One stood out. You really scared me, Mikasa. Maybe we're pushing too hard, maybe it's time to slow down. It sounded sincere, almost sweet. But the sincerity didn't hold up against the context that he and Vanessa were coordinating dosages, tracking symptoms like I was a lab rat. I clicked into the shared family cloud account, the one Ethan rarely touched. I knew its contents better than he did. He thought I used it only to store vacation photos and receipts. But there was a voice memo I'd once accidentally uploaded from my old phone. I listened again. Vanessa's voice, low, sharp. She's making us look bad. Every client wants her. She's not even a Whitman. Ethan, you need to fix this before it spreads. I paused the clip. My hands trembled. Not from fear, from validation. I wasn't crazy. I never was. I opened a new folder on my laptop and titled it The Curtain. And then I started building the case. A new notification popped up. An email from an encrypted sender. You're not the first, meet me. The email subject line read, Don't trust the house. No greeting, no sign-off, just a set of coordinates and a time. It landed in my encryptive inbox at 2:37 p.m. I stared at it for a long time, half expecting it to disappear like some ghost signal. But it didn't. It stayed, taunting, daring. I looked up the address. It pointed to a diner on the edge of East Nashville, just outside the industrial district, a place I hadn't visited in years. I felt a flutter in my chest that wasn't quite fear. It was adrenaline. Recognition. Someone else knew. For weeks, I'd felt like I was assembling this puzzle alone. Now, a piece was falling into place without me having to force it. Someone was watching from the edges, maybe a victim, maybe an accomplice, maybe something in between. I grabbed my jacket and tucked my phone, pepper spray, and a flash drive into my purse. I texted Ryan. Going dark for 2 hours. If I'm not back by 5, trace my phone. He replied in under a minute. Copy. Be smart. The diner looked like it hadn't changed since the 70s. Metal booths, sticky menus, chipped floor tiles, and the scent of burnt coffee that clung to every surface, the kind of place where no one paid attention to anyone, which made it perfect for what I assumed would be a very careful conversation. A woman was already sitting in the corner booth, facing the door. She looked worn. Not old, just exhausted in a way that lived behind the eyes. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy bun, her hoodie faded, sleeves rolled to reveal a thin white scar down one wrist. I recognized her. April Chambers. She had worked at Whitman & Co. for a short time a couple of years ago, Vanessa's assistant. Rumor was she'd quit after a breakdown. Ethan had mentioned her once, flippantly, during a company retreat. Too emotional, couldn't handle pressure. Now, I wondered what that pressure had been. You came, she said softly as I slid into the booth across from her. Her voice was low but steady. I had to, I replied. You said I wasn't the first. She reached into her bag and pulled out a manila envelope, setting it between us. I kept this, she said. They don't know. Not even HR. Inside was a printed string of internal emails, dates, memos, some from Vanessa, some from Ethan, some chillingly labeled MH protocol, just like the file I had found on Ethan's laptop. These were meant for the Henderson pitch, April said. They were testing reactions under stress. Memory retention, language slippage, physical side effects. I was the trial run, you were the real test. My hands curled into fists in my lap. "Why are you helping me now?" I asked. April didn't flinch. "Because I didn't fight back, and I've regretted it every day since." She slid over a flash drive. "Everything I could get before they pushed me out. And one more thing." She pulled out an old voice recorder, one of the clunky ones that still ran on AAA batteries. She hit play. It was Vanessa's voice. "If she's too sharp, it won't work. We'll just have to increase the dose. She won't remember enough to argue," Ethan replied. "I'll make sure she drinks it. It's not like she questions anything I do." April stopped the recording. "I question everything," I said quietly, "just not fast enough." She gave me a look I couldn't quite name. Respect, maybe? Or sorrow? "They'll come after you now," she said. "Vanessa doesn't lose quietly." "I'm counting on it," I replied. Back at my apartment, I uploaded everything April had given me into the pattern folder and made 3 separate backups. One on a flash drive hidden inside a hollowed-out book, one on a private cloud server only Ryan could access, and one in an email draft addressed to Nashville Business Chronicle, unsent but ready. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Vanessa's voice. She's not even a Whitman. It wasn't just jealousy. It was ownership. The Whitmans believed in legacy, bloodlines, brands, and unspoken power. I'd always been a threat to that. Until now, they had the upper hand. But April had just evened the playing field, and I wasn't going to play nice anymore. The next morning, I received a voicemail from an unknown number, just 3 words, whispered, "You're being watched." The room wasn't locked. It never was. That was the first warning. Ethan's study had always been his sanctuary, off-limits, soundproofed, guarded not by locks, but by psychology. He'd conditioned me over the years to treat it like sacred ground. "Work stuff," he used to say. "Nothing exciting. Contracts, legal files. You'd be bored." But the truth was, he didn't think I'd ever have the nerve. I stood now in front of that familiar door on the top floor of Whitman & Co., long after hours, with the hum of the cleaning crew downstairs faint and fading. The building was mostly empty. Ethan had left early after a board briefing Vanessa supposedly chaired in his absence. Perfect. I pulled out the key. I had made a copy months ago. He never knew. The lock turned with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. I slipped inside and closed the door behind me. The scent of the room hit me first. Cedar wood, printer ink, and the faint tang of metallic coffee that made my throat tighten. That smell again. Ethan's desk was a heavy mahogany slab, tidy to the point of obsession, but the real secrets weren't on the surface. I began with the bookshelves, row after row of curated titles, leadership manuals, business theory, behavioral science. But one of the bottom shelves wasn't flush with the wall. I pressed inward. It clicked. Behind it, a shallow drawer cleverly disguised. Inside, 3 small bottles, no labels, just handwritten notations in Ethan's sharp block print. MH trial 2, 2.3 ml increase, low response. Baseline / pre-Henderson V-test 3.7 ml. I froze. V for Vanessa. They had tested it on her, too, maybe in smaller doses. Enough to build tolerance? Enough to simulate trust? I didn't know yet. But now I had more than suspicions. I had physical evidence. I took photos from every angle, labels, timestamps on the shelf, and the drawer mechanism. Then I placed the bottles back precisely and turned to the desk. I'd memorized Ethan's password months ago, his mother's birthday. Like a rookie, his arrogance made him sloppy. The laptop opened with a soft chime. I searched the directory, folders named innocently enough, consulting, Q3 forecast, vendor relations. But nested within client_pitch_archives was a folder marked simply shadow log. I hesitated, then clicked. Inside were dozens of entries, spreadsheet after spreadsheet, each one more chilling than the last. labeled by date with columns like compound use, subject, reaction, behavioral notes, symptom, onset, post-event manipulation required. I scrolled to one dated 2 months ago, the day before I collapsed during a morning strategy session. Compound used, 4.5 ml, cognitive suppressant, recall, delayed recall, visible disorientation, outcome, missed, Henderson prep, excused, absence, accepted, note, dosage tolerable, escalation may be required prior to Q4. I felt nauseous. The screen blurred for a second, but I forced myself to keep reading. There was no doubt now. This wasn't just sabotage. It was methodical psychological warfare. I copied everything onto a flash drive and then took one final screenshot, a scanned handwritten note from Vanessa, attached at the bottom of the final log. We can't keep her in the game if she's always 3 steps ahead. Let's slow her down before she ruins everything. I ejected the flash drive, returned the laptop to its sleep state, and left the study door exactly as I found it. No sign I'd ever been there, but I had the proof. And I had the names. The message on my screen blinked again. You found the drawer, now check the basement. I stood frozen in the hallway, the soft hum of the emergency lighting casting a sterile glow over the floor tiles. The building was nearly empty, just me. The silence, and the echo of someone who clearly knew more than they should. I typed back, "Who are you?" No response. The basement of Whitman & Co. wasn't on any employee map. I only knew about it because Ethan had once mentioned it offhandedly, an old storage level from before the company's major renovation. No badge scanners, no cameras, just a heavy steel door tucked behind a forgotten stairwell near the mail room. I reached the lower level in minutes, using the staff elevator and a copied access key Ethan had left in a drawer once during a weekend conference. I had memorized his patterns long before I realized I might need to exploit them. The basement was colder than I expected. The air had that damp smell of industrial air circulation mixed with something older, like mildew and paper turned to dust. The corridor was dim, most lights flickered or didn't work at all. I walked slowly, phoned flashlight held steady as I followed the old painted arrows on the wall. Records, supply, archive. I paused at the archive door. Unlocked. Inside, stacked filing cabinets lined the walls, old company records from the early 2000s, obsolete client rosters, legal contracts in yellowing fold. But that wasn't what caught my eye. In the far corner, partially covered by a drop cloth, was a rolling cart. On it sat a small metal lockbox. Next to it, an old desktop computer tower, powered down, with a faded sticky note still attached to the monitor. For protocol data only, do not network. My pulse quickened. I approached and lifted the cloth. The cart wobbled slightly under the weight. I tried the lockbox first. It wasn't locked. Inside were vials, smaller than the ones in Ethan's office, but similarly marked. Initials, doses, dates. I took photos, every angle, every label. One vial read, ASS, initial run, unstable, IAC, April Chambers. I swallowed hard. Next to the box was a faded clipboard. Notes in Vanessa's handwriting, recognizable from her planner I used to see during meetings. Subject, AC, too erratic. Not ideal candidate, trial terminated. Escalate to MH, better public profile, cleaner optics. Cleaner optics. My stomach lurched. I set the clipboard down and moved to the computer. I didn't expect it to power on, but it did. A low whir. No login required, no network cable, just a local desktop folder labeled trial footage. My hand hovered over the mouse. I clicked. Dozens of video files. Grainy timestamps, internal rooms I recognized, meeting spaces, hallways, even the small wellness lounge on the 3rd floor. Each file was labeled by initials and date. I played one. April. Shaky footage of her sitting alone in the lounge, clearly disoriented. Picking up a company brochure, then setting it down again. She blinked, slowly. Looked confused. A time code in the corner. Then a voice. Ethan's. Off camera. I can't remember what this is for. Down. Late for something? End clip. Another file. MH_613 MP4. I opened it. It was me, sitting in the conference room, a day before the Johnson pitch, rubbing my temples, struggling to finish a sentence while presenting to the client team. From a different angle than I remembered. They had filmed me. They had documented everything. I backed out of the folder and copied the entire contents to my flash drive. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but fury. They weren't just sabotaging me. They were studying me. Like a case, a lab subject, a variable to be managed. I exited the program, powered down the computer, and carefully placed everything back the way I found it. Then, I paused. What if they knew I'd come here? What if this was part of it? The phone in my back pocket buzzed. Unknown number. Now you understand, but it's not over. Watch your front door. I ran upstairs, heart racing, only to find a plain envelope already slipped under my apartment door with one sentence written inside. Next time, it's your turn, because I was their first test. Those 6 words kept echoing in my head long after I left the archive room. I repeated them over and over in the back of the rideshare car, the driver blissfully unaware of the war unraveling in my chest. He made small talk about the Titans' latest game, but I barely responded. My mind was stuck on one name. April Chambers. She hadn't just warned me, she had been me. I'd seen her name on the vials, her footage, saved in that basement machine like some obsolete experiment. She had been trialed, pushed, recorded, and when she broke, discarded. Was that what they expected of me? No. I wasn't meant to break. I was meant to vanish. The next day I met her at a corner booth in a diner on the east side, same place as before. She looked more composed now. Still guarded, still tired, but not shaken. There was something grimly steady in her eyes, like she had spent years rehearsing for this moment. You saw it, didn't you? She asked, not bothering with pleasantries. I nodded. The files, the notes, the footage, all of it? She exhaled, like that truth had been stuck in her lungs for far too long. I kept quiet for too long, she said. I let them ruin my reputation. I left with nothing but migraines and medical bills, my career over before it started. You were just an assistant, I said gently. Her jaw tightened. Exactly. Which made me easy to exploit. But you were public-facing. You were a threat. I stirred my untouched coffee, not daring to drink it. They said I was unstable, she continued. HR put me on indefinite leave. I checked into a clinic after my breakdown and found traces of something in my system. The toxicologist flagged it as an experimental compound, something that never should have been outside a clinical trial. I leaned forward. Did they admit anything? She laughed, bitter. Vanessa called me once, said I was imagining things, that I should be careful spreading rumors, that I didn't want to damage what little I had left. I swallowed hard. I could hear Vanessa's voice in that same icy cadence, weaponizing politeness. April reached into her bag and pulled out a flash drive. This is the original memo, the one that didn't make it into the system logs. Ethan wrote it, a proposal for a performance deterrent to be used on key assets who show signs of overexposure. You were named in the header. I stared at the drive like it might burn through the table. Well, give this to me now, I asked. She hesitated. Because I'm not going to get justice. Not the way you can. You still have a name. I had to change mine just to get a job at a nonprofit. My throat tightened. April looked at me with something like hope and fear. I need you to do what I couldn't, she said. Expose them. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at a folder on my laptop titled Test 1, AC. I watched the clips again, not just April's, but mine. The way my hands trembled while presenting, the lost train of thought, the look of frustration masked by fake smiles. Each file was dated, logged, and stored like inventory, like I wasn't a person. And then there was a new file, one I hadn't seen before, V_test MP for Vanessa, in a lab setting I didn't recognize. Calm, alert, swallowing a capsule and logging her vitals into a tablet. It was a demo, staged, rehearsed. No reaction, she says flatly. Dosage within threshold. So she had dosed herself to appear clean, to build tolerance, or to shift blame. Suddenly, everything sharpened. Ethan had carried it out, but Vanessa, she had orchestrated it, planned it, perfected it. The perfect predator. My phone buzzed with a text from a blocked number. She's moving fast. Check tomorrow's board agenda before it's too late. I didn't sleep that night. The flash drive stayed plugged into my laptop as I combed through every document, every video, every scan. The more I uncovered, the more I understood this wasn't some reckless act of betrayal. It was a long, clinical dismantling. Calculated, legal, and laced with just enough ambiguity to keep everyone else in the dark. But someone knew. Whoever had texted me about the board agenda, someone on the inside, was watching. By morning, I was on my second cup of burnt coffee and had 3 tabs open, one for the Whitmore Board's internal portal, one for the HR policy page, and one for an anonymous leak submission form I was drafting but hadn't dared send. At 8:01 a.m., the agenda posted. Item 7, Executive Reallocation of Public-Facing Operations and Resource Optimization. I reread the euphemistic mess 3 times before it clicked. They were moving to officially erase my department. Everything I had worked to build, the outreach, the trauma-informed programs, the community grants, all of it was about to be dissolved. The reason? Operational Fatigue and Brand Integrity Review. I recognized Vanessa's phrasing instantly. She wasn't just retaliating, she was erasing evidence. The board meeting was set for 1:00 p.m. sharp. I didn't wait. I sent the anonymous submission with April's files to a handful of journalists, 2 from The Atlantic, 1 from Vox, and 1 from a smaller whistleblower site that specialized in nonprofit corruption. I attached note. Watch item 7 on Whitmore & Co.'s June board meeting, then call me. Then I printed one of the more damning emails, Ethan's draft memo on dosage cycles, and slipped it into an envelope marked confidential. I had no illusions it would stop anything, but maybe it would plant doubt. And if there was one thing powerful people feared more than truth, it was a room full of uncertain allies. By noon, I was seated at a bench across from the Whitmore Tower, watching board members arrive through tinted car windows and revolving glass doors. That's when I saw her. Vanessa. Poised in a gray suit, walking like a woman with nothing to fear. She spoke briefly to one of the board secretaries, smiled faintly, then vanished into the building like smoke. I hated how calm she looked. But hate is not a strategy. So I stood, adjusted my coat, and followed. The boardroom was as I remembered. Long mahogany table, minimalist art on the walls, air cold enough to make your bones forget warmth. I sat near the back as an observer, a title I'd been granted when I was still considered part of the Executive Innovation Circle. Now I was barely tolerated. Vanessa stood to present item 7. Her tone was efficient, smooth, coated in the usual buzzwords. Strategic recalibration, minimizing exposure, protecting legacy programs. She moved through slides with practiced ease, her voice never trembling, not even once. I watched her fingers, steady, her mouth, precise, her eyes, dead. It was like watching someone recite a eulogy for a body they themselves had buried. When she opened the floor for comments, I raised my hand. Everyone turned. Some blinked. Others whispered. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, like she was amused. I cleared my throat. What evidence was used to justify this reallocation, and why now? A pause. Then, with chilling calm, she answered, "This decision is based on confidential audits and feedback from both internal and external assessments. The full report is available upon board request." "I'd like to request it," I said. "Now." Vanessa didn't blink. "Noted." The chair moved on. And just like that, my voice was swallowed by a vote 7 hands for, 1 abstain, none against. It was done. After the meeting, I sat alone in the hallway until the building emptied. The envelope was still in my coat pocket, unopened, unshared. I should have handed it to someone, left it on the chair, slid it under a door, but I knew better. Evidence means nothing when the system is complicit. So I kept it. At 6:13 p.m., my phone buzzed again. No number. She's deleting the tapes tonight. West Archive server, 8th floor. Door access still works with your old code. You have until midnight. I stood outside the Whitmore building, staring at my reflection in the glass. Behind me, the lights on the 8th floor flickered once, then went dark. You'd be surprised how many secrets get traded over avocado toast. The upscale brunch spot in Buckhead, Magnolia Table, wasn't where I imagined my next breakthrough would come from, but the text had been specific. Sunday, 11 a.m., table 9, bring nothing, order the eggs. I showed up 10 minutes early. The hostess, a college-age girl with perfect skin and dead eyes, led me past mirrored walls and soft jazz into a corner booth draped in filtered sunlight. I slid into the seat, table 9. A minute later, she arrived. The woman was older, late 60s maybe. Designer scarf knotted tight at her throat, sunglasses far too large for the cloudy weather. But it was her voice that gave her away. "I knew your mother," she said, setting her leather clutch on the table with delicate precision. "In ways your father didn't." I froze. "Excuse me?" She smiled, unfazed. "Relax, Ms. Whitmore. I'm not here to drag ghosts from the grave. I'm here because you asked the wrong question at the right time." The waiter approached. We both ordered eggs. Her name was Diana Lockhart, and she used to handle legal compliance for Whitmore & Co. before retiring for medical reasons. A phrase I'd later learn was code for getting too close to something dangerous. Diana had overseen several transitions of leadership and had worked directly under both my father and Vanessa. She knew where files were buried, literally and metaphorically. "Your op-ed," she said between sips of bitter coffee. "Brave? A bit naive, but brave." I didn't bother responding. She slid a small file folder across the table. I opened it carefully. Inside, an old memo dated 6 years ago. The header was familiar. Project Dover, the same label I'd seen in April's encrypted folder, but this version had annotations and signatures, my father's, Vanessa's, and Ethan's. Below them, a note in blue ink, subject consent waived, medical justifications appended. My stomach clenched. "What were they testing?" I asked. "Not what," she said. "Who?" She leaned forward, her voice lower now. "You need to understand that what happened wasn't just about your removal or your department being shut down. That was a consequence. The root? That began long before you were promoted." I blinked. "Are you saying you weren't the first?" "Just the most inconvenient." She walked me through it slowly, the funding reallocation, the off-book clinical trials masked as outreach, the list of volunteers whose records had been sealed or scrubbed completely, and then she dropped the bombshell. "Your mother was one of them." I couldn't breathe. "She worked with us under a different name," Diana continued. "Part of a trauma response study. Pregnant at the time. She asked to be removed after a disagreement with the lead medical officer." "Ethan?" I asked. "No," she said quietly. "Your father." The world tilted. Her withdrawal was denied, Diana added, and she vanished a week later. Official story was a car accident on her way to Florida, but the autopsy, I saw it. Trauma didn't match impact patterns. I flagged it. The file disappeared a day later. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, gripping the edge of the table like it could anchor me. Because I'm dying, and I want one thing clear before I go. She paused. Your father didn't just cut you out. He erased everything she tried to protect. That file you saw in April's drive, that was her work, her last project before they took it away. I sat back, dizzy. You have more? She nodded. Meet me tomorrow, Midtown Library, back study room. I'll bring the rest. Then she stood, dropped a 20 on the table, and walked out like she'd just finished a casual brunch with an old friend. But I knew better. This wasn't brunch. This was war. As I stared down at the memo still in my hands, one sentence caught my eye, circled in fading red ink. If she finds out the truth, the entire foundation burns. I didn't sleep that night. The words Diana Lockhart left me with kept circling like vultures over an unburied truth. Your father didn't just cut you out, he erased everything she tried to protect. I sat cross-legged on the floor of my apartment, the file still open beside me. I had reread the phrase subject consent waived so many times that the ink seemed to blur. I had always known something was off about the way my mother died, but this wasn't just suspicion. This was the edge of a fire, waiting for a match. The Midtown Library was an old brick structure tucked between a boutique wine shop and a Pilates studio, its entrance hidden beneath ivy and the weight of decades. I arrived early. The back study room was quiet, empty, its frosted glass doors swinging open without a creak. I waited for exactly 17 minutes before Diana walked in. Slower than yesterday, her eyes dimmer. She looked tired. Fragile. Bad night? I asked. Terminal ones usually are, she replied, with a thin smile, and set a box down beside me. Inside were documents. Streams of printed emails, signed authorizations, copies of clinical intake forms. But the top layer? Photos. Black and white surveillance stills. The first was grainy. A woman entering the back of the Whitmore Clinic, belly swollen. She looked terrified, my breath caught. It was her, my mother. I hadn't seen her in years, not even in dreams. But the tilt of her shoulders, the way she carried herself, there was no mistaking it. She used the name Laura Dalton, Diana said softly. That's how she signed up, but she was no ordinary subject. She was an insider. She had access. I flipped through more photos. One of her arguing with a man in a lab coat whose face was blurred, another of her standing outside a door labeled B17, private access only. And then one that nearly stopped my heart, a shot of her hugging a child, a little girl with curls and a red bow in her hair. In the corner of the photo, a date. June 12, my birthday. She wasn't just protecting herself, Diana whispered. She was protecting you. I swallowed hard. My fingers trembled. What was B17? I asked. Storage, Diana said. Genetic samples? Off books? Projects? Including one labeled Echo? And what was Echo? Diana hesitated, then pulled out a sealed envelope. This, she said, is where the bodies are buried. I opened it slowly. Inside, a signed consent form from 1994. Project Echo. Subject, Laura Dalton. Voluntary withdrawal requested. Rejected. Overrate approved by Executive Authority Matthew Whitmore. My father. He had personally denied her right to walk away. And less than a week later, she was dead. It was hard to breathe. The library walls seemed to close in. Every cell in my body screamed at once. Grief, rage, guilt, and something else far colder. Resolve. Diana leaned back, coughing now. You have enough to go public, she rasped. But if you do, they'll bury you too, figuratively or otherwise. I'm not afraid, I said, though my voice was tight. You should be. She took a beat, then slid a USB drive across the table. This is encrypted, 3 layers. Password is your mother's middle name. I blinked. I don't know it. You will, she said with a knowing look. Soon. She stood, shoulders sagging. This is where we part ways, Emily, she said. I've done all I can. The rest? That's on you. And with that, she walked out, just like she had from brunch the day before. Quiet, deliberate, like a ghost retreating into the fog. That night, I sat at my desk, the USB drive gleaming under the desk lamp, the photos, the documents, the consent form. My mother had been a whistleblower, a target, and maybe, just maybe, a woman trying to shield me from the inferno my father had built. I opened my drawer and pulled out the Warren family photo, the one my father had kept in his office all those years. I flipped it over, written faintly in blue pen, nearly faded, to my daughter, from Eleanor, middle name Grace, Eleanor Grace Whitmore. My hands shook as I typed it into the drive. The screen flickered, a folder appeared, the Project Echo. I clicked, the screen loaded, and the first file opened with a timestamp. And the name of the first subject. Subject 1, Vanessa Whitmore. Vanessa wasn't just part of the project. She had been its beginning. They say names carry weight. Mine was forged in betrayal. Growing up, Whitmore was a name that opened doors, demanded respect, whispered legacy. But today that name felt like a poisoned crown, passed down not through love, but through manipulation and control. I stared at the screen, eyes locked on the first file from the Project Echo folder. Subject 1, Vanessa Whitmore. The description was clinical, almost cruel. Age, 14. Status, unstable. Early signs of emotional dissociation. Parental consent obtained. Primary guardian listed Matthew Whitmore. My father hadn't just authorized it, he had initiated it. I clicked on another file. Subject 4, Emily Whitmore. My stomach dropped. Age 3. Status, controlled environment. Maternal input no longer relevant. They experimented on me. Not metaphorically. Literally. I drove without knowing where I was going. Windows down, the night air sharp against my skin. Atlanta's skyline blurred past as my hands trembled on the wheel. By the time I stopped, I was in front of a house I hadn't seen in years. Uncle Daniel's place. He'd been my mother's brother, the only blood relative who'd ever treated me like I mattered. After her death, my father cut him off completely, claimed he was a bad influence. I never knew why. Until now. I knocked once. The door creaked open slowly. Daniel stood in a worn flannel, eyes weary but alert. He blinked as if seeing a ghost. Emily? I nodded. I need answers about Mom, about Dad, about why you disappeared. He looked past me into the night, then stepped aside. Come in. The inside smelled like cedar and old coffee. The walls were lined with books, photography, medical ethics, theology, a contrast to the sleek, sterile world I'd grown up in. I tried to fight for custody, Daniel said after I explained everything. When Eleanor died, I knew something was wrong, but Matthew had money, power, lawyers, and a sealed will. My mother's will had never been shown to me. He confirmed what Diana suspected. There had been a different version, one Eleanor had drafted months before her death, naming Daniel as my guardian if anything happened to her. But it vanished. Matthew made me look unstable, Daniel said. Drug records, fake testimonies, said I was bipolar and unfit. And you let him win? He flinched. I couldn't beat the machine. I thought maybe if I stayed quiet I could keep an eye on things, but then you disappeared from the clinic logs, no school enrollment, no photos, nothing. I assumed the worst. I was there, I whispered. All along. He leaned forward, eyes burning. Emily, if he put you through what he put Vanessa through, he did, I said. But now I have the files. I can prove it. Daniel exhaled shakily, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a thin red folder. Then maybe you need this, too. I opened it. Inside was a copy of a paternity test. 2 names: Matthew Whitmore, Emily Grace Whitmore. Result: 0% probability of biological relation. I stared at the numbers. Daniel's voice cut through the silence. You were never his daughter. The world didn't spin, it shattered. I didn't cry, not immediately. I folded the test result with mechanical precision, the paper crackling like dry bones between my fingers. My mind refused to process what it meant, that I was a stranger in the very house that raised me, that my entire identity was a lie and delivered by a man who never loved me. Daniel poured 2 glasses of bourbon, but I left mine untouched. I need time, I finally whispered. To do what? To decide who I am, now that I know who I'm not. Back at the apartment, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by fragments of my stolen past. The Project Echo files, my mother's hidden will photocopied and initialed, the paternity result, photos of Vanessa's bruised arms from the clinic, and the press release Matthew's office was set to publish the next day. Whitmore Foundation awarded $12.00 M grant for Youth Therapy Initiative. Therapy, of course. The same kind of therapy that shattered me and my sister. The hypocrisy churned in my gut like acid. I had everything now: proof, motive, names. But I also had a choice. I could destroy Matthew publicly, file a legal case, go to the media, watch his empire crumble in slow motion. Or I could walk away, be done, let the ashes bury themselves. But then I thought of Vanessa, of how her hand trembled when she held a pen, of how she still called him Dad. She deserved to know, not the watered-down version, the whole raw, unvarnished truth. And so did the world. The next morning, I dressed with purpose. A navy blue pantsuit, sharp collar, no jewelry. I emailed Diana and told her to meet me outside Whitmore HQ in an hour. As I approached the glass tower, everything around me seemed to slow. The weight of generations pressed down on my shoulders, but I didn't flinch. The receptionist recognized me immediately. "Miss Whitmore?" "Not anymore," I said quietly, handing her a sealed envelope. "This is for Matthew." Then I stepped back out into the sunlight. The steps of the building were already filling with press. Diana stood near the fountain, phone in hand, nodding toward the growing cameras. "You ready?" she asked. "No," I said. "But I'm not hiding anymore." We walked side by side toward the makeshift podium. The silence before I spoke was deafening. I took the mic. "My name is Emily Grace Whitmore, and today I'm here to tell you the truth about the man who gave me his name." I unfolded the test result, held it up. "And the truth is, he never gave me anything that wasn't laced with pain." Gasps rippled, flashes popped, and somewhere inside the building, Matthew Whitmore's carefully constructed world began to tremble. And just before I finished, I spotted a familiar face at the edge of the crowd. Vanessa, pale, shaking, staring at me like she'd seen a ghost. Then she mouthed 3 words that froze my blood. "He knows everything." Thanks so much for watching Family and Heart Stories. If this story touched you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more heartfelt dramas every week.